My speed test forked the entire school.
I get it. Oh, that's from my other class. What's that sound?
Yours? His.
Yeah.
Drive spinning up.
Is that your hard drive or your ROM?
I really hate to say that because I know it's people can take it the wrong way. Does it come with a pull cord? I had old hard drives where it was getting old and would not start up correctly normally. It just need a bang, like knock it from the side, and it would just. I guess it knocks the spindle loose enough that the motor can actually start spinning. But once it starts spinning, everything is good. So just don't shut it down.
I have an iPod like that.
Huh?
I have an iPod like that.
iPod?
Uh-huh.
But iPods don't have any moving components inside.
This is an older one. This is the fourth generation.
Oh, the old ones, yeah.
Fourth gen.
How old does everybody think Apple has before it goes away?
Well, I think mass store is going to be going away, very soon. So a lot of cell phones, would not need even 2 gigs of flash anymore, because it's all going to be cloud-based. Whatever you store is up there.
I don't want cloud-based.
Well,
on my phone. I want it on my phone.
You want it on your phone, but when you change your phone, or if you lose your phone, then you lose everything. If it's up in the cloud, you can lose your phone and it doesn't matter.
Who's looking through the cloud, though? Who's looking through your cloud?
Who's looking through the cloud? That's a very good question.
I'm not important enough to care.
I'll direct you to the movie called Summer War.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be a good movie to watch. Maybe we should watch the movie as a part of the class.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be wise. That should be our final.
Yeah.
The final would be, give me a report on the movie.
I love it.
That would be a
We'll have the final the week before, and then just for the final.
Oral discussion.
Yeah,
Oh,
but this
yeah,
is
I love debate.
this is an
Yeah.
interesting movie. Interesting in many ways because it combined elements of many different aspects of technology. The people who put this together also put together the Digimon show from way back when. So there was that definitely kid cyberspace fighting type of scenario. But the backdrop of the story is actually quite interesting. I'm not going to spoil the storyline, so you guys have to watch it. But it has to do with the approach that we are using now to store everything in the cloud, and also how everything is now also being controlled by computers, and how all the computers are all networked together. So all you have to do is to imagine, what if people store passwords, in their cloud accounts? Passwords to the type of computer they have to access at work. Okay, let's say you're a traffic controller. Okay, so you need a password to log into the traffic controller website, or the SSH, log in and whatnot. What if you store that password in the cloud? Well, yes, you can definitely think of hackers, right? Human hackers to hack into specific accounts, try to steal secrets away and whatnot. But human hackers can only hack so quickly, can only deal with one account at a time. So the story explores, what if it is not a human hacker that's hacking these cloud-based resources? What if it is an AI? That's the question. So it's an interesting story, and I think parts of this is actually somewhat realistic. I mean, it can happen in the near future. It's just that we don't have a malicious AI yet to do something like that. So it's a cool movie. Yep.
I thought the use of bandwidth towards the end was a little excessive.
The bandwidth use?
Yeah. They're getting like 5 teraflops a second over a satellite uplink.
Oh, they were. I didn't remember the actual number. Yeah, but
It is fiction.
it is it's interesting too. If you look at this part here, in the background. Let me see. Oh, okay. See this little, kind of like a shooting star thing? In the movie, you will find out what it was. Okay, it's a it's a response from the computer, from the upset computer. It's like, I'm not happy with you guys. So that's a good movie to watch. And then the other one, if you guys like that sort of storyline, the other one would be the classic is Ghost in
Oh yeah.
the Shell.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that that's also they come in a movie form and also in and movie as well as series. There were 2 series, and I think 2 or 3 movies. From this particular storyline.
In an awesome video game.
3.
Three movies.
I have them all. I have the whole series.
Okay, and then 2 series, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also kind of
2
interesting.
seasons.
It's I think this one is interesting in many ways because it is projecting a possible future. Because if you think about replacement limbs and whatnot, what if parts of the brain can be replaced? Because we already have human tissue interface where a computer can directly interface with nerve endings. So once you have that, all you have to do is to, well, not all, but you can see how this can progress where the connection is no longer limited to just hands and legs, and also interface directly with your brain. Okay, so you can start off with people who have handicap, certain parts of the brain not functioning, and you have devices to help regulate parts of the brain. But after that, healthy people can use it as an add-on. You can soup up your cognitive capability.
I'm ready.
You're ready.
I need it.
We can store man pages in your brain. GCC, GDB, install Linux all over there.
I was always curious about that. What if you just put like a calculator in your brain? Would you really need math after that?
Math and arithmetics are 2 things.
Well, I guess maybe you just focus more on the logic after that.
Right, you can focus more on how to prove theorems instead of actually figuring out the numbers. I mean, we already know how to figure out numbers. We have spreadsheets, we have calculators, we have all kinds of tools to deal with precision type of calculation. But we don't really have a lot of tools to deal with proving theorems. It's getting there. It's getting better. When I went through calculus classes, my calculator doesn't know what is integration. So all integration has to be done by hand. But these days, your calculators can figure out integration by symbolically. It's not even numeric. It's all symbolic. So we are definitely slowly but getting there. I mean, calculators are getting more and more efficient.
I think we discussed in my differential equations class that there's a lot of differential equations that are difficult for a computer to solve.
Certain differential equations are difficult to solve, because they are representing real life situations. So it's not theoretical, and we don't have a closed form, closed mathematical form for everything that we want to model. So a lot of times those are all empirical and not really theoretical. All right. So getting back to the real-time kernel, last time we stopped here. We talked about preemptive thread change, which leads to the next topic. The next topic, is priority queues. We kind of briefly talked about priority queues. Basically, what a priority queue is, everything in a queue is basically in a ring or in its own round-robin setting. You can set up a system to have as many priority levels as you want. Anything more than 5 is probably pointless. I would just, usually limit it to 2 or 3. But basically what you need to do is to figure out what things are most important, okay? These tasks or these threads cannot to have, delays. Okay, I need, really, really good timing. When I say that I have, this needs to happen every 5 milliseconds, it can only be 5 milliseconds plus or minus 200 microseconds. So that would be top priority. The next priority level would be stuff that, well, yeah, we can kind of wait, 5 milliseconds plus or minus 5 milliseconds is not a big deal. Okay, so you can put those in the second priority level, and then you can have a third priority level for things that are happening just in the background. Okay, things that are not important at all. Timing is not an issue. We can do it when we have time, but if we don't have time, it's not a big deal. Okay, so now you have 3 levels of priorities. And what happens with a priority queue is as long as a higher priority queue has a thread that needs execution time, none of the tasks or threads of a lower priority can get control. That's what it means when it's a priority queue. Is that okay so far? Within a priority queue is a round robin setting. Okay, so within those, you can either use cooperative multitasking, which means each thread will say, yield, I'm done, it's your turn to do something, or they can give up control based on time. Okay, when you give up control based on time, you're basically scheduling and say, hey, wake me up at this time. But during that time, you're not using any processing time, and the other threads can get more resources during that time. Are there any questions about this part? Now, priority queue and round robin scheduling are not always associated. In other words, in some real-time kernels, quote unquote cheap real-time kernels, they do not support round robin in priority queues. What that means is each thread has its own priority. In other words, you can also say that a queue, each priority queue can only have one thread. That's a lazy approach because they don't have to implement the circular queue data structure, where if you want to support round robin, then you have to support the a linked list, so you can have a circular queue in that particular setting.
So each thread has its own priority?
Correct. In a lazy approach, in a lazy approach that does not want to implement the data structure for a circular queue, then each priority has its own thread, which is okay in some settings, but in some other settings, it's not, as nice. So
the different levels have their own thread.
Right. Then you have to assign priorities to all the different threads because each one has to have one thread, has one priority, I should say. The next one talks about time-based, scheduling, which is also a very important thing. And for some reason, my website is slow. Okay, so time-based scheduling means, what if a particular thread is doing something, but at the same time it knows that, oh, okay, since I'm waiting for something to happen, I know I don't have to do anything for the next 500 milliseconds. Well, you have two approaches. You can either get in a tight loop and keep looking at the clock and say, have I waited 500 milliseconds? Have I waited 500 milliseconds? Have I waited 500 milliseconds? But that's taking up a lot of processing time. If this particular thread is a high-level thread, that means during that time, none of the lower priority threads have a chance to execute, which is not good. So instead of doing that, you can say, sleep for a certain amount of time. In other words, you can tell the kernel and say, I don't need to do anything until 500 milliseconds later. So what the kernel does is to remove it from the queue, from the round robin setting, and set it aside to another queue, so that every time you have a timer tick, when the timer ticks each time, the kernel is aware of time. So every time the time itself is updated, it will compare to the first thing in the queue of threads that are waiting for a particular time. When it is time for a thread to execute, the kernel will put the thread back into the queue, back into the round robin setting, so that it can execute in the next round when that particular priority queue has a chance to execute. So are we kind of doing okay so far? Okay.
It's a little fuzzy. So how does the kernel keep track of time?
The kernel keeps track of time based on interrupts, based on hardware interrupts, and the hardware that's generating the interrupt is called a timer. A timer is a really simple device. All that it is a count down or a count up timer. It doesn't matter which way it counts, but it counts and it goes to a particular quote-unquote limit. If it's counting down, it's typically just 0. When it reaches 0, it causes an interrupt. When it's counting up, you can usually specify what is the limit where it will trip cause an interrupt. When the interrupt happens, the kernel is responsible to handle the interrupt. And typically the kernel only has to increment a particular counter by 1. So we are not really doing timing based on milliseconds or microseconds. We're counting it by number of quote-unquote ticks, interrupts from the timer. But typically, people usually set up a timer so that when it does interrupt, the period is a fraction, a reasonable fraction of a second. So that way it's easy to translate the number of ticks back into units that we understand, like milliseconds and seconds. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, the timer is just a very simple device. Its only job is to interrupt every so often, but the timing is always accurate. It always interrupts, every half a millisecond, 400 microseconds, or whatever you want to program it to be.
So like your kernel would then just keep track of how many
Ticks.
ticks
How many
from that timer?
the number of interrupts, right? Everything gets translated into the number of interrupts. That's how we represent time inside the kernel. Question?
If I can remember. Wouldn't that, is there some way to say I need to run every X milliseconds, or do you have to do this? Because this seems like you would have a variable period based on how long it actually took your routine to run.
Okay, to answer your question, there is a way to do this, and because what you can do is the kernel does not only keep track of time, like okay, I want to sleep for 500 milliseconds or something like that. It can actually report back a quote-unquote absolute time from the moment that the machine was turned on, or from the time the real-time kernel starts up. So you do have a quote-unquote absolute measurement of time. Once you have that, you can just say, okay, I'm going to increment the current time by 500 and wake me up at that time. Most real-time kernels can take it either way. You can give it an absolute time to wake up, or you can give it a relative time to wake up. So what you're suggesting, or what you want to do, is to give it an absolute time. Because every time you want to schedule for the next time, it's just 500 milliseconds plus, the last time this logic was triggered.
Okay.
So that you can use this approach to do what you want to do. But the precision of this is usually not very good, because it still depends on a lot of latency and lag of the higher priority queues, whether you have other threads within the same round robin, and so on. So this approach can only get you close to the time that you want, but not always exactly the time that you want.
Okay.
If you want exact time, like really, really low latency, what you want to do is to attach your logic to one of the timer's interrupt service routines. That way you get the least latency, but you have to be very careful in that case to make sure that your logic does not tie up the processor for too long, because when you are handling a particular interrupt, no other interrupt can happen. Okay, so if your ISR or your interrupt service routine is taking too much time, then the latency of all the other interrupts can suffer. Are we doing okay with that topic? Okay. So this approach, saves processing resources because we don't have to do busy wait, and the kernel is the only one that has to use an internal timer to schedule, to determine which thread can go. Now, to make this even more efficient, most real-time kernels keep a list of threads that are waiting for a particular time, sorted by the time. So that way, you're only comparing to the first one, in the thread. You don't have to compare to all the time of all the threads, because if it is sorted and you compare to the first entry of that particular linked list, and that one is not yet time for that one to go, you know for sure that none of the other ones is ready to go yet. Okay, and that's usually the case. I mean, for the most part, you're just saying, oh, is it time for this to execute? No. So most of the time the answer is no, and therefore if you can just say no to one instead of having to go through the entire list, it saves you a lot of time.
So, okay, so you've got the linked list for that level, for that priority queue level.
Right.
And then basically they're kind of in a lineup so that you know that your next timer is
The way
the
I
lowest one, or
Well, the way I implemented mine is only to have one linked list for all the threads that are waiting for a particular time. Now, when it is time for a thread to wake up, I put the thread back to the priority queue that it does belong to. Now when I attach a thread back to the high priority queue, guess what? It will execute first because it's in a high priority queue. If I attach a thread to the low priority queue, then it doesn't get to execute until the high priority queue or the threads in the high priority queue are all done already. So I don't use one, basically sleep, linked list for each priority. I use one global linked list for all the threads.
And they're kind of in a line according to when their time is
Correct.
ready.
It is all sorted by the time, when they're supposed to wake up.
That's pretty cool.
But you can definitely use the other approach too. It's just, in most cases, it is not necessary to keep track of that. Question?
No.
No? Okay. So this is really useful, and this is partially, why, real-time kernels are called real-time kernels, because they are aware of, the time. Time slicing is kind of optional, but it is really helpful. Because even though you can use a yield to basically inside each thread within a priority queue, you can call a function called quote-unquote yield and say, hey, I'm ready to give up control at this point. If there are other threads within the same priority level, go ahead and let them run. Okay? But it is not always easy to figure out where to put your yield. Okay? Is everybody getting this part? Especially when you have subroutines. So if you have a subroutine that takes a long time to execute, do you want to put yields within that subroutine? Maybe, maybe not. Okay? So that's why time slicing comes in handy, because when you have time slicing in a real-time kernel, then it is not the thread that has to figure out when to yield. The kernel is going to come in and forcibly remove a queue from being active or turning it into inactive and make the next thread within the priority queue to execute. So that means when I'm writing a subroutine, I don't have to worry about, is this loop going to take too long? Should I insert yields within each iteration of the loop and stuff like that? I can just write the logic naturally and then rely on the real-time kernel to say, okay, this thread has executed for 5 milliseconds already. It's time to stop it and let the next thread of that priority level go.
So it is within a priority group.
Correct. Everything is still respecting the priority. In other words, if a thread in a higher priority queue has something to do, it will always get it done before a thread of a lower priority gets a chance to execute. So time slicing ensures that even if threads do not voluntarily give up control, the processor resources, meaning processor time, will still be fairly distributed among the threads of the same priority. There's no way to guarantee that the lower priority threads have control, because if you have a lot of stuff to do with your high priority threads, it is possible that the low priority threads do not have sufficient time to execute. And that means, and that is always true, because someone can always specify a processor that is slower than what the application requires. So you cannot fix that in software. The only thing you can say is, assuming there's enough processing power, the real-time kernel can make sure that things that require attention can get done first. Things that are kind of in the background, not so important, can get the remainder of the processing time. And this one talks about the inter-thread communication. In this particular real-time kernel, I use semaphores instead of mutex. Semaphores and mutex have the same expressive power. In other words, if a particular real-time kernel only gives you mutex, you can always implement semaphores using mutex. And the other way is true as well. If a system only gives you semaphores, you can always use semaphores to implement mutex. And that's an easy one, because a mutex is a semaphore that can only count to 1. And this part explains what a semaphore is. I'm not going to do too much of this.
So the time-based scheduling is you either use time-based scheduling or time slicing, or to use them together, or is it kind of two different ways?
They are two different things. They're in a way they are independent.
Independent. That's
In a way they are independent, because one is basically saying, okay, I'm a thread. I get to a certain point. Let's say I turned on a motor, and I know the motor takes about 600 milliseconds to spin up. So for the next 600 milliseconds, I really get nothing to do because I'm waiting for the motor to spin up to a certain speed. So instead of busy waiting and say, okay, is it 600 milliseconds yet? Is it 600 milliseconds yet? I just tell the kernel, hey, I'm going to go to sleep for 600 milliseconds. Wake me up after 600 milliseconds. So that's one feature. That's the time aspect. And then the other one, time slicing, means I have some heavy-duty processing to do. Okay, I'm going for FFT transform, Fourier transformation, which takes a lot of time. And what time slicing is saying is, I don't have to worry about the other threads not getting any execution time because the kernel will only give each thread up to 2, 3, 5 milliseconds to execute. After that amount of time is up, the kernel will come in and say, hey, even though you did not say yield, I am going to take control away from you and switch to the next available thread. So the next thread gets to execute. So these two features are not, one does not always imply the other one, but they are both time-based, and the real-time kernel does have to keep track of time in order for either one to work.
But you would probably use them at the same time, would you?
You can use them at the same time because certain threads may have natural points where you want to wait for a certain number of seconds or milliseconds, and other threads may not have natural stopping points like that, or they may have long bursts of computation before they get to a point to stop for 10 seconds. So these two features, they don't imply each other, but they can work together within the same thread.
So with your time-based scheduling, would you ever have a conflict where you would have, because if you're putting it into a queue, right, a linked list or a queue. So if you have one that you put in the linked list that's for a long time, and then I guess you would, if you're putting another one in the linked list, you just find out where it fits in the link.
Correct.
List, right?
Yeah, every insertion has to maintain the linked list so it remains sorted.
Yeah.
But that's O and big O of
Yeah.
n an operation, and you cannot really make it any faster than that. I suppose you can if you use a tree structure, you can make it log n, but even order of n is not a big deal because those calls do not happen too often. Question? Okay. All right. So the next one, really just talks about the actual files. This has to do with the distribution, so I'm not going to go through this one because we are not going to play with this real-time kernel. And section 4 obviously is just how do you download the file and how do you install the file. It's just one tar file. Once you unzip the file, you have all the source code. The source code is distributed with this real-time kernel. I'm not even sure whether it still works. Nice. I can show you the source code because some of you may be slightly interested in, okay, but what does it look like, inside the real-time kernel? So let's go ahead and take a quick look.
How much memory do we need to put it on something?
On the device that it is targeting, in terms of compiled or assembled code, it only takes 2 kilobytes. Yeah, as in 2,000 bytes. Just in case someone thinks, you meant 2 megabytes, right? No, 2 kilobytes. 2,000 something bytes. And the source code is all here. I implemented everything pretty much in assembly. CQ stands for circular queue, and the real-time kernel is rtk.uppercase-s. We don't really talk about assembly programming much in this class, so I'll just go ahead and show you the source code. And it's all written in assembly. It's all written in assembly. And this is not an instruction set that we use in this college. This is the AVR architecture. So it's a semi-Risc architecture. And so the instruction set is kind of foreign to all of us. But all assembly instructions are almost the same. They are all related. That's it. The program, the kernel itself has about 1,200 lines, and that's including a lot of comments. I put in a lot of comments because I cannot remember what I'm doing. You know, a few weeks later, I cannot remember what I was doing. So that's why I had to put in a lot of comments to make this work. That's the main file. You know, about 1,200 lines of code, all in assembly, nothing written in C. But they're all interfaceable to C. So even though the real-time kernel is written all in assembly, the interface to talk to the real-time kernel is all C compatible. You can have a C program to interact with the real-time kernel, and that was the intent. I did not want people to write in assembly to use the real-time kernel. It was intended to work with C programs. Any questions, comments? No. Okay. There are sample programs here. You know, this is a cooperative two-threaded program. We can take a look at this. You know, because it may resemble certain parts of the programs that we write in this class. Okay, don't worry about the output. You know, those are for controlling the output devices on the MCU. This sets up the real-time kernel's the scaler for the time slicing. And we have real-time kernel initialize, and this should look a little bit familiar. This is your pthread create, only that I did not call it, you know, pthread create. I call it real-time kernel thread add. So I'm adding a thread, but the interface is very similar to what we are doing. The first parameter is the entry point of the thread, which is the address of a function. The second one, we don't use it in this class because we don't have priority queues. But in the case of a priority queue, this is telling the real-time kernel that this particular thread belongs to the highest priority queue. Okay, you know, anything with a low number is high priority. You know, anything with a higher number is a lower priority queue. In this case, because I don't have a operating system already, the allocation of the stack for this thread is manual. So I have to say, you know, where is the stack for this particular thread? And inside here, the Rtk thread yield is basically the cooperative approach, which says, you know, I'm done for now. Let the other thread, whatever it is, to have a chance to execute. Any questions about the real-time kernel? Questions? Important application-dependent macros. The first one, you know, this one defines the number of queues. In other words, how many priority queues do we have? So you can make it a high number, you can make it a low number. You know, a lot of stuff is not easily checked, you know, in this particular kernel because we don't have an operating system. And then there are a few other macros. Okay, I think I'll just go ahead and skip to the API, the Application Programming Interface. Struct thread is our pthread underscore t. That's the type of the data structure that is going to represent a thread. Okay. We don't have queue in pthreads because, you know, when you're using pthreads in Linux, you cannot control the level of the priority. So we don't have that. But in this particular case, you know, there's a data structure for the queue. So we'll kind of skip some of this stuff here and go to Rtk Initialize. Rtk Initialize is the initialization of the entire real-time kernel, and it takes two parameters. The first parameter is a thread structure that will become the thread structure for main itself. Because unlike in pthread, now when you use pthread, when you gcc-pthread, that automatically makes the main program or the main entry point its own thread already. It is already a thread. But in this case, I don't have any code that executes before main. So I have to explicitly say, oh, create a thread structure for the main program and associate the main program to this particular priority queue. So your main program can execute as a particular at a particular priority level. If your main program is not going to do anything that's important, it's just sitting in the background doing something that is not important, you might want to put it into a low priority queue. On the other hand, if your main program is doing important stuff, then you have to put it into a high priority queue. But it's up to you to decide. Yep.
So when would this be executed?
This will execute before you do anything else with the real-time kernel, because it initializes everything that the real-time kernel requires. So that would be the first call.
Well, so if you're running a program that you created, would you call that in your program, or does this like when you turn on the chip? When does?
And he's asking, how does it get created? I mean, how does this call ever get executed if it's not in a main program?
It should be called in the main program. Let me show you one of the sample programs. This one would be good. Okay, so here we have a sample program. Let me change the font size so we can see a little bit better. There we go. Okay, so here's a sample program. This part of the program sets up the timer. Remember what I said about timers? You use a timer to give you that frequency of ticks. So this will take every so often. I think the comments might have explained the actual frequency. It also depends on the clock of the processor and a few other factors. But when you look at the main program, these 3 lines, just initializes the output of the MCU, because this program only does one thing: it blinks 2 LEDs alternately. Okay, and the first real call to the real-time kernel is this one. In other words, I am initializing the real-time kernel, and at the same time, I am associating the main entry point, the execution point up to this here, to the highest priority queue in the real-time kernel. But it doesn't have to be the highest one. You can make it the lowest priority or whatever. At the same time, I'm adding another thread to the whole thing. I'm adding this, and subthread is a data structure for the other thread, and it is also going to the highest priority queue. This is the stack intended for the new thread. This is the entry point of the new thread, and I cannot remember the last parameter what it's for. Now you can look at thread 2. This is the entry point of thread 2. In my particular implementation, it doesn't return a void pointer, because most of these threads do not terminate. In a robotic or embedded application, you don't really stop things at the end. So that's why I don't really give it a way to return. There's no way for a thread to terminate. So in this case, this particular thread will just kind of blink one of the LEDs, and it will do it indefinitely.
So what is running that starts up this? Is it just the kernel is the kernel basically in the thread, or?
No, the kernel doesn't thread. The kernel does not become active. It is linked, but it does not become active until Rtk Initialize.
So what is executing that code?
What is executing?
This code.
Your compiled program.
This part here, as soon as the MCU or the microcontroller unit gets power and go through its reset phase, this gets controlled immediately.
Okay. And then it starts up a thread to run this program?
It starts up the real-time kernel, and the real-time kernel, okay, this part initializes the real-time kernel, but the real-time kernel really doesn't have anything to do until the timer is all set up and interrupt is enabled.
Seems like kind of a chicken and the egg.
Yeah, well, the chicken and the egg is reversed compared to our Linux pthread situation. In Linux with pthread, you have a real-time, you have not a real-time, but you have a kernel, you have an operating system up and running already that can take care of the initialization and among other things. Then your main gets control, and by the time main gets control, main itself is already a thread, and you also have a helper thread ready, so everything is all set up for you. In this particular situation, there's no operating system. When main gets control, nothing is initialized. Interrupt is still disabled. None of the I/O devices is set up, and the only thing you know for sure that is already set up are your global variables that should be initialized. Those will be initialized. So anything that is specific to C, yes, you can kind of count on that being done, but anything other than that, there's no operating system to take care of anything.
So there's other things executing on the, in the system or on the chip or.
At this point, there's
whatever.
nothing. When you get into main the first time,
Well, it's like setting up the variables, right? Global
yeah,
variables.
that's based on when you compile and link with GCC, there is some code that executes before main itself gets control. And that code is typically responsible to initialize your initialized global variables. Anything that's static, that should be initialized. And that's before main gets control. But that's the only thing you can count on in this particular situation. Because there's no operating system to speak of. Your program, quote unquote, is the operating system. It is up to you to implement everything.
So, but you got output, right? Output functions. What is?
The output is output actually translates to the appropriate assembly instructions, and they are for controlling I/O registers or input/output registers. So in this case, I am controlling or configuring 2 of the pins of the chip to be output pins instead of input pins. The next one turns off both LEDs. And then the last one here enables idle mode, and that means when the processor has nothing to do, it will execute a sleep instruction, and the sleep instruction is nice because it reduces power consumption considerably. Okay. Those are good questions.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time understanding what the difference between that output function call and set timer is. What are those?
Okay, so you're comparing these 3 instructions with set timer 2. Set timer 2 is a subroutine that's up here, and it has its own bunch of output instructions. The output instructions in this case is just communicating with the quote-unquote input-output registers corresponding to timer 2. So I'm trying to configure timer 2 to interrupt at 5 kilohertz.
Are those are the output instruction or that isn't something that you had to implement in your kernel? It's just part of.
The output function is specific to this architecture. It translates, most of the time they translate directly to assembly instructions to interact with an input-output register.
They're whether no matter what you're putting on the chip. Even if you didn't have your, if you put some other code on there, you didn't basically write those at all.
I did not write output.
Yeah.
Yeah, output is provided already. It's usually provided as a macro.
Okay.
Yep. Any other questions? Yep.
Since your real-time kernel is handling time slicing, wouldn't your when you fire that up, wouldn't that always be on the real-time kernel initialize
Nope.
array element 0?
No, because when the real-time kernel does not come into play until, this part is only initializing the data structures required for the real-time kernel, but the real-time kernel code does not have control yet at this point, because it is only until these 2 execute that the timer will start to tick. Before the timer starts to tick, the real-time kernel is actually dormant. It doesn't really have a chance to do anything. It's only after these 2 instructions that your timer starts to tick and interrupt starts to happen that your kernel will get execution time periodically. Then it can do its time slicing, its scheduling, and whatnot.
But it could be in a lower priority queue?
The real-time kernel? No, the real-time kernel is quote-unquote attached directly to the timer's interrupt. So every time the timer causes an interrupt, it goes to a portion of code of the real-time kernel, the portion that has to keep track of time, the portion that has to keep track of time slicing, the portion that has to release threads when they're waiting for a particular time. So the real-time kernel really gets control from the interrupt of the timer itself. And that doesn't happen until these 2 executes, because before these 2, the timer 1 is not set up, and 2, the interrupt is not even enabled. If interrupt is not enabled, the timer still does what it's supposed to do, but the software is not getting the interrupt. So it's only after the SEI, or SEI stands for Set Enable Interrupt. Until that one executes, nothing really happens. The real-time kernel stays completely dormant at that time.
So the SEI, basically it sets up the interrupt and it kind of tells where to start executing the code again once that interrupt comes through.
Well, there are two quote-unquote setting up the interrupts. The first part of interrupt that is set up is done by set timer 2, because the timer itself also has the option whether to trip an interrupt or not. So I'm setting up the timer 2 so that it will trip or cause an interrupt when it counts to a certain threshold. But there's another global flag that disables or enables all interrupts, and that's the global interrupt flag. So this one, SEI, is enabling the global interrupt flag so that I can now start to receive interrupts, and the software now can respond to interrupts.
So these in your output functions, those macros that are in there, is that part of that's part of the architecture as well, right?
That is, you mean TMISK, T counter to, OC output compare register to, and so on. Yes, those are very specific to the model of the MCU that I'm writing this code for. Okay.
Good. It kind of is a little more application of the interrupts.
Oh, this is all about interrupts.
Yeah.
This is all about interrupts. I think it may be helpful to show you the data sheet. They call these data sheets of the chip that I'm using, that this code is intended for. And some people would just look at this and frown, because let's look at the total page number of this document. 377 pages. That's the quote-unquote data sheet of this particular part. Everything that you want to know about this chip will be in these 377 pages. So that includes the registers that we were talking about, TIMSK, how those particular registers are used to control the behavior of the timer, is all documented here. So you can kind of imagine writing software for a platform like this, involves a lot of reading. Not cover to cover, but you do have to read the portion that is relevant to what you want to do.
So is your real-time kernel, is that specific to this chip, or does that?
No, the real-time kernel is a little bit more general. It's just that the sample programs are more specific to this particular chip. But all the chips manufactured by Atmel, that is an AVR, they all share a fairly common structure. So you can modify the code, usually pretty easily to make it work with, another chip from the same manufacturer. And can anyone kind of guess how much this chip will cost? Let me show you the features of this chip. They usually, this is a good picture of a schematic picture of the pin out of this particular chip.
That's small.
This is actually one of the bigger chips. This is the bigger chip of the AVR line. It's a 64-pin chip. The actual size of this chip is about the same size as your thumbnail. Okay, so you look at your thumb, the thumbnail. That's pretty much the real size of this chip, and it has 64 pins around it. Soldering this chip is fun.
That's why they use robotic placement now.
Oh, I use masking tape and a loop. I use a loop, masking tape, nudge it a little bit, and then soldering is actually easier than most people think. Okay, the way you do, if you think about it, soldering can be a little bit challenging, because look at your thumb. What is the width of your thumbnail? I would say that's probably about 0.7 inches or so, 0.7, 0.8 inches. So within 0.7 inches or so, you have to fit 16 pins. So the density of the pins is a little bit high. And they give you a physical description too, at the end of these data sheets. They always give you specifications of the packaging and stuff like that. So let me go take a look at, there we go. We have the physical 64A. Yep, that's the one that I want. Okay, we want to look at the pin-to-pin distance, which is lowercase e, lowercase, where's lowercase
Your
e?
bottom.
0.8, and that's 0.8 millimeter.
Capillary action for the win. No capillary action for the win.
Yes. So the way I do it is I just blob the whole thing, just use a lot of solder, just blob it the whole thing up. And then I use solder wick, or they call it desoldering braid.
Yeah,
Yep.
solder wick is the more common term.
Solder wick is a trademark.
Yeah.
I'll get back to that story. Okay, desoldering braid is basically tissue paper for solder. Okay, so you heat it up, and then you put it next to things that you want to have solder removed, and once it heats up and solder starts to flow, which means it is molten, and in a state where it can it can stick to a metallic surface really well, you can actually see the solder just wake up the solder wick or the desoldering braid like water up tissue paper. So then you just use that approach to wake up or dry up to draw all the excess solder into the desoldering braid, and it's soldered. That technique works exceptionally well, and you can do it without expensive equipment. Now getting back to the solder wick story. Yeah, this is all kind of like fun stories that I had. Solder wick. Solder wick. Solder wick is a trademark for this particular company called Chemtronics, and it describes their version of desoldering braid. Okay, but solder wick is a very common name. People usually just refer to those things as solder wick. So I was using the name solder wick in my notes, for my micromouse class, because I had to teach people how to solder and how to deal with soldering. And one day I got a letter from an attorney representing this company and say, you cannot use the name solder wick in your documents because it is a trademark. Okay, and obviously you can see they intentionally spell solder as S-O-D-E-R instead of S-O-L-D-E-R. The L is silent, so that the name itself can be trademarked. You cannot use common words as a trademark. So this is definitely not common because it's not the proper spelling for solder, and therefore it can be trademarked. I was only using the common name S-O-L-D-E-R, solder wick, in my documents, but the lawyer says, this is too close to our trademark and you cannot use it. So what I did was I changed my documents not to use the name, solder wick, and I explained why I cannot use that name in the same document. Yes, look at this fine company. They contacted me to inform me that this would not be a proper name. Yep.
And yet, if they let you leave it in there, then when all of your students Googled this, they would get their product.
Yes.
Advertising.
Yes.
So why would legal care?
Because the lawyers want their pay. It's not even the
company.
It's not the company is clueless. Okay, the company looks at the whole thing and they're completely clueless of the downstream consequences of going after people like myself, who's just trying to tell people, what kind of product they can use to clean up solder, regardless of the brand.
They should be thrilled.
Yeah.
The business side of the company probably didn't even know that he said.
Yeah.
They would be thrilled if they knew, but legal just figures they got to do something to earn their money.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
Yep.
don't know any better.
Yep. So I just put in my documents, the whole story, what kind of, letter came to me from an attorney, and that's why I cannot use the name solder wick anymore, and, I have to use the word desoldering braid.
You should have given other company names. Other.
Yeah, these companies also manufacture products that are desoldering braids. Yes.
And their attorneys don't contact me.
Yep, their attorneys have not contacted me yet.
And if these companies want to pay me to use their trademark name,
Well, if their legal departments read your response to the previous legal department, they might decide not to do anything at all.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think they care. Okay, we can now. This is actually a pretty good place to actually explore a little bit, because I want to show you what these chips can do. I know it is not related to Linux systems programming, but a lot of times people do system programming because they are getting close to the hardware. They're getting close to the hardware, and this is pretty close. That's pretty much as close as you can get. The architecture is called the Risc Architecture, and it has 133 instructions, unique instructions. 133 seems like a lot, but they're counting the instructions that map to the same mnemonic. Like LDI, can work with different registers, and they're probably counting different registers as a part of the 133 combination. This architecture is very interesting because the instruction set was intentionally developed so that it is friendly to C compilers, and yet also friendly to people who want to do assembly programming by hand. So it's extremely well optimized for both purposes, and I think it's just a really good trade-off between CISC architectures, or complex instruction set computers, and Risc architectures. There are architectures out there, Risc architectures out there, that are more quote-unquote pure, which means they want to reduce the number of instructions to like 40, 50, or something like that. But when you go to that extreme, it becomes extremely difficult for people to hand code anything, because now you have to write like 3 instructions for every single one of this instruction set. It has 32 8-bit registers. Sorry?
What's the trade-off of that, going more pure versus?
Oh, if you go more pure, then the die size would be smaller, and also you can tout, this is actually a pure Risc machine. Those typically come from universities.
Does that have to do like with, because we're in our data discrete mathematics class, we're talking about adders and half adders.
Mm-hmm.
Is that basically like an instruction set, right?
The concept of an adder and a half adder is the basic, quote-unquote, basic implementation of an adder for addition inside the processor. But in real processors, they don't use carry propagation, where you only propagate from the neighboring full adder. They have cross paths, for real adders, so that you don't have to wait. If we implement adders, it's not the same logic exactly. Yep, they do something. They use something that is more optimized for speed, and the trade-off is you have to use more silicon. We have 32 8-bit registers, fully static operation, which means it's not dynamic RAM. It can run up to 16 megahertz. Wow. In a day where we look for 3 gigahertz for our processor clocks, this one can go to 16 megahertz.
That's faster than my first computer.
Oh, this is faster than even the IBM PC-AT. Remember the PC-AT uses the 286 processor? This thing can run circles around that. But it's even more impressive later on. It has built into it 128 kilobytes of in-system self-programmable flash memory. This is where you store your program. You have 128 kilobytes of program space, basically. When was the last time you wrote a program that compiles to 128 kilobytes?
1980. When I got rid of that first computer.
Oh, this is actually a huge amount of program space. Okay? Now, program space has a lot to do with the density of the instructions. In other words, if your instruction takes up 4 or 5 bytes and it can only do this much per instruction, obviously your program will get very big because it takes a lot of space to store a program that can do anything useful. The code density of this instruction set, even though it's a Risc architecture, is actually pretty high. The code density is high, so in 128 kilobytes, you can store a lot of stuff. I can tell you, actual data points regarding the code density. My micromouse students, when I still taught micromouse at UC Davis, they can fit the logic of a dumb terminal emulator. Well, not an emulator, but it can communicate using Bluetooth communication with a cell phone or whatnot. Motion control using stepper motors, sensor interpretation logic, path optimization maze-solving logic, and so on and so forth, the entire program for a micro mouse is only about 32 kilobytes. and we are only using 1/4 of the available space for program space, even for a robotic application. That is, I would say that's somewhat complex, because you have to do error correction, you have to do path planning, you have to sense where the walls are, you have to keep track of the walls, then you have to do some planning and say, from here, I want to go there, what is the quickest path to get there? Even with all this logic included, it's only about 30 kilobytes. So 128 kilobytes is actually quite a bit of code. We have 4 kilobytes of internal SRAM, and that's where your variables go. This is where your heap is, this is where your global variables go, this is where your stacks go. 4 kilobytes. And that's why when we program these things, we have to count by bytes. How can I save this byte? How can I save a few bytes here and there? Write erase cycles, that means you can reprogram the program space 10,000 times, and then the flash will start to fail. Data retention, if you don't do anything, it can retain its program and the state of its EEPROM for 20 years at a high temperature, which is 85 degrees Celsius. If you're in room temperature, it will last 100 years. It is still a definite amount of time. Over time, it will lose its content, just like CD-ROMs and DVDs. What is the lifespan of a regular CD-ROM, an audio CD-ROM?
Burned or pressed?
Pressed.
Pressed is something like 15 years?
Yep. Unless it is gold foiled, or you store it in an environment where oxygen is depleted. So you can use nitrogen purged environment to make sure there's no oxidation. You guys know that oxygen can go through plastic, right? Very slowly, but it will go through plastic. And pressed CD-ROMs or music CDs mostly use aluminum. What is the oxidation, or what is aluminum oxidized? Aluminum oxide. What does it look like?
White.
It's transparent. It's transparent. So your CD will gradually become transparent and therefore lose its data.
So is this, the data retention, is that basically
Not used, not
is that-
powered.
If it's it's not powered, or
If it's not powered, in 100 years it will start to lose its content.
but if you power it up, it resets it.
I'm not sure whether powered up will save it. You basically have to reprogram it, once in a while, so that you reset the clock of 100 years. So in theory, I'm not an electronics guy, so I guess in theory you can multiply this number by this number, so that becomes the longest amount of time they can retain this data. I don't think that's really true, but I think you can, in 50 years, you can refresh the content once, so that it has another 100 years before the content will will start to lose its content.
So at some point when we're all dead,
Yes,
stuff
at some
is going to start failing.
And nobody cares.
Well, we won't care.
We won't care.
So if you had one and you just never used it, would it eventually degrade to the
Yes,
point where you
all
couldn't-
electronics will eventually degrade, because every electronic equipment that we use is still based on the PN junction. And the PN junction, in the PN junction, they have impurities in silicon, and the impurities actually it will move around a little bit, very slowly, but they will move around. And when they move around too much, then the electronic device will basically stop working. So every electronic device, actually has a certain lifespan beyond which it will stop functioning. It's a material thing. It's not whether you even power that thing up or not. It doesn't matter. Okay, we'll go ahead and skip some of this stuff here, and I'll just go ahead and describe some of the other features down here. We have 2 8-bit timers and 2 16-bit timers. So internal to the chip, it has 4 timers. Okay, that means you can assign different timers to trigger different types of operations, which comes in handy. It has 2 8-bit post-width modulation channels, and 6 post-width modulation channels with programmable resolutions from 2 to 16 bits. What is post-width modulation? Can anyone kind of guess what that means? Yep.
My guess from when I saw it previously, and didn't really look it up much, was that it was essentially a way to transmit, if you will, binary, but using more than simply zeros and ones logically by having different.
Right.
Yeah.
So the average of the output can be somewhere between 0 and 1. Okay, I can give you an example. Your furnace is a post-width modulation, quote-unquote post-width modulation device. Because what happens is, if your furnace turns on every, okay, let's say it has a cycle of 15 minutes. Okay, every 15 minutes is one cycle. Now within that cycle, if for every cycle it only turns on for 2 minutes, the output of the furnace is not a whole lot. On the other hand, if your furnace decides to turn on for 10 minutes for every 15 minutes, then it's actually putting out a lot of heat. So if you look at the state of the furnace, it's on and off. Okay, you cannot control how much it's outputting. But by controlling the proportion of on time versus a period, you now can control the proportion of the power that it's outputting. It's the same thing that you can use to control the intensity of LEDs. And I have one right here. Okay, so this is an LED flashlight, and it's at a very low, quote-unquote low setting at this point, and now it's at a higher setting, and now it's even at a higher setting. But this is all done by post-width modulation. In other words, the LED device itself is actually, well, okay, I shouldn't say the LED device itself, but there's a circuit inside the flashlight that's turning on and off things, either turn it on completely or turn it off completely. But the time, each period is so small that it is not perceivable by human eyes. In other words, it can be up to, let's say, 400 kilohertz. Okay, when it is blinking at 400 kilohertz, our human eyes cannot see it. But it's blinking, but by controlling the on time versus off time, you can see it. It's either dim or bright or even brighter because we're controlling the proportion of on time versus off time, and that's post-width modulation. Why would post-width modulation be useful with an MCU device? Well, this is one application, right? You can control the quote-unquote intensity of something by only using on-off type of switches and not having to require analog control. Yep.
Servos. Servo motors?
Servo motors, very good. And 6 channels is particularly intended for DC brushless motors. Okay. So it's really quite useful for those applications. How many people know what is a DC brushless motor? In what context? Robotics. Does anyone play with RC airplanes or RC helicopters? No? Those are pretty geeky toys. I'm kind of surprised that nobody in this class has one that has a little camera, so it can fly in first person.
They're expensive. They're expensive.
They can get expensive, but the $40 ones are still pretty good. $30 to $40 ones, 3.5 channel ones, those are pretty good. Yep.
You also have to have a license for them. If you have a camera on them, you have to have a license for them.
Ah.
No, if you solve it yourself.
Now, what if the camera is not feeding live, back to a viewer? What if it is just taking snapshots, and you have to download that picture after you land the helicopter? What if I mount a mirror on the helicopter and have a video camera to go like this?
That's fair game.
So
I have to ask that
helicopter
question.
and a turret, and both of them have to have some way of aligning themselves. And
Yeah, Dead Reckoning.
yeah.
Fiber optic.
Yeah.
You can use a fiber optic to relay, a picture from the helicopter down here.
But then you'd have to have the helicopter have a lot of upforce, otherwise it wouldn't be able to carry the fiber.
A lot of lift.
Yeah.
Helium-filled fiber optic cable, helium insulated.
I think a mirror would still work.
Yeah.
A mirror with a good stabilizing mechanism would work.
No, you just buy a plain RC helicopter and you install the camera on there.
Oh, so then you don't have a license? You don't need a license?
You don't have a license. You don't have to.
You don't
If you
have
buy the ones with the cameras, you have to have a license.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
That was not clear the first time you said it. Okay, so we'll go ahead and finish up this part here, because I think someone in this class is going to get interested and go get an Arduino set after the class. What is an ADAC? An ADAC stands for Analog to Digital Converter. Now this is also really cool, because if you think about the input into an MCU like this, typically it is binary. Okay, am I seeing a high voltage on this pin? Am I seeing a low voltage on this pin? It's either there or not. But an analog to digital converter says, well, we can actually tell what is the actual voltage within a certain range that this pin is seeing. So depending on what you are doing, I think it's a 10-bit. Okay, it's a 10-bit ADAC, which means you can divide from 0 volts to the highest voltage that the chip operates. It will give you 4,096 divisions in this case, because 10-bit is only 1024. Excuse me. It will give you 1024 divisions. So you can. So let's say the device operates up to 5 volts. So now you can tell down to 5 divided by 1024 volts. That would be the minimum voltage change that this device can detect. Okay. Why would that be useful? Well, now you can interface it to thermistors, because you can take analog input to the device. You can know the temperature. You can know the light level of the surrounding. You can measure the voltage of the battery, so the robot can remember, okay, I need to shut down now because my battery is running low. So you can do a lot of things with an ADAC. It has byte-oriented 2-wire serial interface. This is for interacting with other chips. Dual programming serial USART, that's really useful. Now this used to be like, people don't really care about USARTs or universal synchronous asynchronous receiver transmitters. And that's a really old technology. RS-232, remember the RS-232 cables that you had to connect to your modems, and some of the printers also use serial communication. It seemed to be a thing of the past, but now people find that they're really useful for interacting with Bluetooth devices. So with these two, you can actually hook up a Bluetooth transceiver to your robot or whatever application, and then you can externally use your cell phone, assuming you have a Bluetooth dumb terminal on the cell phone. You can now actually externally interact with your device using a dumb terminal, and I think it's really cool. I have an application that actually does that. Here's another interface to interface with other chips. So what can you do with a chip like this? Lots. Okay, it's about 12 bucks or 10 bucks or so, depending on how many you order at a time. So for people who are interested, you can look into Arduino projects.
There's a U in there.
Arduino. Okay, so that's a chip. It's a board using a particular AVR chip. And you can use it to do, a lot of things. Some people use it to implement a remote control lawnmower. I want mine to be driven by GPS. I don't want to have to stand there to remotely control it. It can get dangerous too.
What's that little one that vacuums your floor?
The Roomba.
The Roomba.
The Roomba is actually a very dumb device.
Yeah.
Okay, the Roomba is actually very dumb because it just walks randomly. And hopefully it will cover every square inch in the area, but it's not intelligent in any way.
Oh yeah. Well, if you had one for
My
your
understanding is they've updated the logic a little bit to try and keep track of what areas it's not picking up as much dirt from.
But
and
how
give
does
the
it?
other one air.
It's hard for it to know where it is in the room, because it doesn't have any beacons. So the only thing it can use is the external, structural landmarks, and
Yeah.
that's always difficult. For robotics to keep track of where it is.
Yeah.
Secret knock detector. door lock. That is funny.
I've seen that one on YouTube.
Really?
Yeah.
So you have to give it a secret door
Yeah,
knock,
you
like
can
knock,
program
knock, knock,
which
knock.
knock, yeah.
Yep, and then it will unlock the door.
How do you deal with the dead battery?
Breaking the window.
Screwed.
That's what I was afraid of.
Well, you have a backup battery, or it will text you when it's running low. It will text you when it's running low. Well, you may find it kind of funny, but these things, someone has written a TCP/IP stack for this type of architecture. If you want to, you can actually have these things to hook up to a Ethernet NIC, and actually have it to talk TCP/IP.
Actually, there's one that's a tweeting. Hold on, it's a kegerator, so it's a beer refrigerator that tweets the current temperature of the beer and how much is left, and estimates how many cups you can get out of it.
That's cool.
There's another one project, I think, on Instructables, where you can make it monitor your houseplants, and it'll text you when your houseplants need to be watered.
That's cool.
Twittering laser tripwire with webcam capture.
That's cool.
Now that is cool. A lot of these projects really push these architectures to its limit, because capturing webcam is not simple. You have to clock out the bytes one by one, because the webcams, even though it has a digital interface, it's not easy to extract all the data out of the webcam. 20 unbelievable Arduino projects. So there you have it. And all of these, or most of these, use chips that are smaller or with less capability than the one that we just described. The one that we just described used to be the flagship of their entire line of processors. Now they have a 256 and a 16-bit version, 32-bit version of the AVR core. So they have really upscaled quite a bit these days. Are there any questions? Is anyone interested in this sort of thing? Some of you? Yeah. And the best thing is, when you do something like this, you don't have to program in assembly. Did I cover how you write programs for these things? GCC, GDB, make, the same tools that you have been using for this class also work for this particular platform. Now sorry, go ahead.
Arduino, I know, is in the repository, the Linux repository.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly what it does, but I saw it there.
Yeah. It has a library of all the code that other people have written. Basically, people who write code for this sort of thing want to open source their code. They want other people to be able to use at least portions of their code. Just so that you know, most embedded architectures do not have free development tools. You can pick a really obscure architecture or platform where you have to pay $3,000 for one seat of the development tool set. And it's not even close to as good as GCC. And with this architecture, you just use GCC, you use GDB, and all the same tools that we use in this class, except you don't say GCC to compile the program, you use AVR-GCC or GCC-AVR. So change your make file. I'm sorry, you have to change your make file to make that work. Yep. So we are running out of time today, and I'm trying to make a connection between multi-threading and real-time kernel to embedded processing and also MCU's microcontroller units. So I'm not sure whether that's working or not, but that's for sure.
Are we going to wind up doing socket 4 eventually?
Yeah, we'll do
work
socket
on
4
that?
eventually.
Okay.
Yep.
So we can work on that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm gonna need a bunch of lecture before I can work on it.
Well, it's actually easier than you think it is.
Okay, that's good. That's very